Welcome everybody to Victor's Forbidden Desire. Please do enjoy this next video.
The December lamplight is dying. Every man on the Braddock Range is asleep. Two men sit awake across a narrow table in a silent bunkhouse. And the foreman, who has run 11,000 acres without flinching at anything Wyoming ever threw at him, is completely still. The young ranch hand across from him has just said 4 words. 4 words dismantling 11 years of iron personal rules, like fence posts pulled from frozen ground. Nobody knows. Nobody can ever know. And yet Reuben Stade understands, with the cold clarity of a man who has never once lied to himself, that he passed the point of turning back months ago. How did it come to this? If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you're watching from and subscribe. The summer of 1873 came to the Braddock Range like a fever that refused to break. Heat pressed down on the red Wyoming earth from the moment the sun crested the eastern ridgeline until the last molten sliver of it sank behind the bluffs to the west, and even then the land held the warmth like a grudge, radiating it back up through boot leather and into bone. Reuben Stade had worked this land for 11 years. He knew every dry creek bed, every stretch of fence line that leaned 2 degrees past plumb, every water hole that went brackish in August, and every cow that had a habit of testing the wire at the northwest corner, where the posts sat shallow in rocky ground. He knew the Braddock Range the way a man knows a scar on his own hand, without having to look at it, without having to think. He simply knew. That knowing had made him foreman at 29, a fact that still drew quiet resentment from men who had come to the range older and left it no further along than when they arrived. Reuben did not apologize for what he was. He never had. He was not a large man, in the way that word usually gets used out on the frontier, not the barrel-chested brawler type, not the kind of man who filled a doorframe and made other men take a half-step back on instinct. What Reuben Stade was instead was precise. Everything about him had been filed down to its essential function over years of hard use, the way a good knife gets worn to its truest edge. His shoulders were broad but not thick. His hands calloused and quick, his jaw carrying 3 days of dark stubble that never seemed to grow longer or shorter regardless of how much time passed. His eyes were the color of creek water over gray stone, and they missed very little. He ran the Braddock Range with a quiet authority that the ranch hands learned to read the way you learn to read weather. A certain stillness in him before a storm, a particular set to his mouth when something was wrong. A measured economy of word and motion that told the men everything they needed to know about what was expected and what would not be tolerated. What Reuben Stade did not do, had not done in the 11 years he had worked this land, was let anything get under his skin that he had not invited there. He had rules for himself. He had always had rules for himself. They were not written down anywhere, not spoken aloud to anyone, but they were as fixed and solid as the fence posts he drove into the Wyoming earth every spring. You do not drink on work nights. You do not carry a grudge past sundown or a fight past the moment the other man is down. You do not let the land defeat you, even when the land is doing its absolute damnedest to try. And you do not look at the men who work under you as anything other than what they are. Hands on a payroll, faces under hat brims, names in the ledger that old Braddock kept in the ranch house safe. Reuben Stade had lived by those rules for 11 years without exception. Colt Deaver arrived on a Thursday in late June, coming up the south road on a sorrel mare that looked like she had earned every step of the journey from wherever he had started. He sat the saddle easy despite the distance clearly behind him, one hand loose on the reins, the other resting on his thigh, and there was something about the way he carried himself, even road-worn and dusty, that made three of the hands who were fixing the water trough near the gate stop what they were doing and watch him come in. Reuben noticed that. He noticed it the way he noticed everything on the Braddock Range, with the flat, recording part of his attention that cataloged information without yet assigning it meaning. He was standing on the porch of the bunkhouse when Deaver dismounted, and he let the man approach rather than walking out to meet him, a small thing that told you everything about how Reuben Stade conducted himself. The new hire came to the foreman. That was the order of things on this range. Colt Deaver was younger than Reuben had expected from the letter old Braddock had shared with him. 23, perhaps 24 at the outside, with the kind of lean, rangy build that belonged to a man who had been doing physical work since he was old enough to hold a tool. His hair was dark and pushed back under a sweat-stained hat, his face angular and sun-bronzed, carrying that particular combination of openness and wariness that you saw sometimes in men who had grown up hard and learned early that the world did not offer anything freely, but had not yet decided to be bitter about it. His eyes were a shade of brown so deep they read almost black in the afternoon shadow of the hat brim. And when he looked up at Reuben on the porch, he did not look away. Most new hands did. Not from fear exactly, but from that instinct that makes a man drop his gaze in the presence of authority while he is still figuring out the terms of his position. Colt Deaver did not drop his gaze, and Reuben marked that without expression, filed it away in the same quiet internal ledger where he kept everything that mattered. "Deaver," Reuben said, not a question. "Yes, sir." The voice was low and unhurried, carrying no particular accent, but the general weathered sound of a man who had moved around enough that all the regional edges had worn smooth. "Reuben Stade?" "That's right." Reuben stepped off the porch and extended his hand, and the other man took it without hesitation, the grip firm and undemonstrative. "You ride from Cheyenne?" "From a ways south of it." Deaver tilted his head slightly in the direction he had come from. "Stopped overnight in Larkspur." "You're 2 days late." Something moved briefly in those dark eyes. Not apology, not defiance exactly, but something that acknowledged the statement without collapsing under it. "Mare threw a shoe outside of Dry Creek. Took most of a day to sort." Reuben looked at the sorrel, who was standing patient and easy at the rail, and he could see the new shoe on the left fore, the nailwork clean and competent. He looked back at Deaver. "You do that yourself?" "Found a man in Dry Creek willing to lend his tools." Reuben nodded once. The single downward motion that the hands on the Braddock Range had learned meant the conversation had been heard and evaluated, and they could proceed. "Bunkhouse is through there. Second bunk on the left is open. We start at 4:30, and we don't stop until the work is done. Braddock pays on the 1st and the 15th. You drink, you do it on your own time, and not before. You fight, you better win. Because I don't have patience for men who start something they can't finish, and you'll finish it off my range either way. Any questions?" Deaver looked at him for a moment with that steady, unbothered attention that Reuben was already beginning to find faintly unusual. "No, sir," he said. "No questions." He took his saddlebags off the mare, led her toward the stable, and that was the end of the first conversation Reuben Stade had with Colt Deaver. It was not, unfortunately, for the 11 years of unbroken personal rules, anywhere close to the last. The Braddock Range ran 11,000 acres across terrain that tested a man in every season, flash flood country in spring, blinding heat in summer, early ice in fall, and in winter a kind of cold that did not arrive with wind and drama, but simply settled in around 3 in the morning and sat there until April, patient and absolute, leaching warmth from every source it could find. Summer Roundup was the month that sorted the men from the ones who thought they wanted to be men, and Reuben had seen more than a few hands fold in the first week of it, quietly collect their wages, and ride back to whatever town they had come from without meeting anyone's eye on the way out. He watched for it with new hires, not unkindly, but without sentiment either. The range needed men who would stay, and men who would not stay were better off discovering that fact sooner rather than after they had burned through everyone's time. He watched Colt Deaver through the first week of Roundup with the same measuring attention he gave everything, and what he saw was not what he had expected. The man worked. That was the first and most important thing, the baseline beneath which nothing else mattered. He worked without complaint and without performance, which was a rarer combination than you might think. Some men who work hard need you to see them doing it. Deaver seemed indifferent to whether anyone was watching, which meant when you watched him, you were seeing the actual man rather than a performance of the man. And what you saw was someone who knew cattle, who could read terrain, who made decisions in the field that were sound and that he did not second guess afterward. On the third day, he roped a steer that had gotten itself tangled in brush in a narrow draw where 3 other hands had already tried and given up, doing it with a patience and an economy of motion that made one of the older hands, a man named Perch who had been working cattle for 30 years and was not given to complimenting anyone on anything, spit in the dirt and say nothing, which on that range was as close to admiration as the old man got. Reuben noted it. He noted everything. That was the job. What the job did not require, and what he therefore had no business doing, was noticing the way Colt Deaver moved when he thought no one was paying attention. The loose, unhurried quality of it. The way he sat a horse like the two of them, had a private agreement about how things should go. The way he pushed his hat back off his forehead when he was working through a problem and forgot he was doing it, revealing the line where the sun had stopped at his hat brim, and his skin went from bronze to a fairer shade, a detail so small and so entirely irrelevant to running a cattle operation that Reuben could not explain to himself why it stuck in his memory the way it did. He could not explain it, so he filed it under the category of things that did not require explanation and moved on. This worked for approximately 12 days. The breaking point, if you wanted to call it that, though it was not a breaking point so much as a hairline fracture in something he had thought was solid, came on a hot Tuesday evening when the day's work had gone long because 300 head had drifted south toward the canyon country overnight, and the retrieval had eaten the whole of the afternoon and most of the early evening. The hands came in exhausted and covered in red dust, the particular kind of tiredness that sits in your joints and makes even lifting an arm feel like an argument. Most of them went directly to the bunkhouse. A few stopped at the water pump behind the stable. Reuben was checking the tally on the day's work at the fence beside the stable when he heard the pump running and did not think anything of it until he came around the corner and found Colt Deaver there alone in the last red light of the evening, his shirt off in the heat, using the pump water to rinse the day's dust off his face and neck and arms. Reuben stopped. It was not a calculated stop. It was the involuntary kind. The kind where your body has already made a decision before your mind has caught up with it. And by the time your mind arrives, you're already standing still, already looking, already in a position where the honest thing to do is admit to yourself what is happening, and the easier thing to do is pretend you stopped for some other reason entirely. He had seen men without their shirts before. He had worked alongside them for 11 years. He had stripped his own shirt in summer heat 1,000 times without thinking about it. None of that was relevant, because none of it had looked like this. Or more accurately, none of it had made him stop walking in the middle of his own ranch yard and stand there with the tally sheet in his hand, and his heart doing something complicated and unscheduled in his chest. Deaver hadn't heard him come around the corner. He had his head tilted back, the water running down his throat. his eyes closed, and the last light of the evening was doing something entirely unreasonable to the lines of his face and shoulders and the water on his skin. And Reuben stayed, who had 11 years of personal rules and a reputation for a steadiness that nothing on this range had yet managed to disturb, stood there in the shadow of the stable wall and felt something shift inside him with a slow, tectonic certainty that he recognized immediately as trouble. He turned around and walked back the other way before Deaver opened his eyes. That night in the bunkhouse, while the other men snored and the Wyoming dark pressed down on the low roof, Reuben lay on his back in his bunk at the far end of the room and stared at the ceiling and had an honest conversation with himself about what was happening. He had learned in 40 years of living and 11 years of running other men that honesty with yourself was the only productive kind of honesty. Lying to other people was sometimes necessary and sometimes kindness, but lying to yourself was always waste, always compound interest on a debt you would pay eventually, regardless. So he was honest with himself. He was honest about what had happened at the pump. He was honest about the fact that it had not started there, that it had been building in the accumulated weight of 12 days of small notations in that internal ledger, the grip of a handshake, the steadiness of a gaze, the sound of a voice that did not perform itself, the way a man sat a horse when he thought no one was watching. He was honest about all of it. And having been honest, he drew the conclusion that his 11 years of personal rules required him to draw. This was not a thing that could be allowed to become anything. It was not a thing that would be allowed to become anything. Colt Deaver worked on the Braddock Range. Reuben Stade ran the Braddock Range. That was the entire shape of whatever existed between them. And that shape would not be altered. He closed his eyes, resolved, and slept with the clean conscience of a man who has looked at a problem clearly and decided on its solution. He did not account for the fact that problems of this particular nature have very little interest in the solutions men decide on for them. The following weeks had the quality of something that is being carefully contained, without the container knowing it is already too small. Reuben threw himself into the work with an intensity that the other hands noticed and attributed to the pressure of roundup season, which was convenient and also accurate because the work genuinely needed doing, and it was genuinely his job to drive it. He put Deaver on the far sections where possible, working the eastern fence lines and the canyon approach, places that required a capable man, and also places that kept a capable man a reasonable distance from the foreman's immediate orbit. This was rational. It was defensible. It was also, he knew in the honest part of himself, a form of retreat, which was not something Reuben Stade had ever made a habit of. The trouble with retreat, in the physical world as much as the interior one, is that the frontier does not have infinite room for it. A ranch is a contained space. The men on it move through the same narrow channels day after day. The stable, the water pump, the cookhouse, the bunkhouse, the fence lines that loop back on themselves like the closed circuit of a life lived in one place. Avoidance on a cattle range has a natural limit. That limit arrived on a Wednesday afternoon when a section of the north fence came down in a place where the posts had gone soft with rot over the winter and 40 head pushed through before anyone caught it. Reuben took 3 men to get them back, and because the 3 nearest men, when the call came, were Perch, a young hand named Dills, who was not yet reliable in rough terrain, and Colt Deaver. Those were the 3 men he rode out with. They spent 4 hours in the broken country north of the fence line, moving cattle out of draws and off ledges. And in 4 hours of that kind of work with 3 other people, you cannot maintain a careful architecture of distance. You simply cannot. The work doesn't allow it. Twice, Reuben and Deaver came together naturally at a narrow cut where the cattle were trying to push back and had to work in close coordination, close enough that he could hear the other man breathe over the sound of the cattle and the wind, close enough to read the small shifts in Deaver's body that telegraphed where he was going to move next, which was information Reuben found himself absorbing with a speed and precision that alarmed him, because you did not learn to read a man that quickly through simple professional attention. You learned to read him that quickly because you had been paying far more attention than the job required for much longer than you wanted to admit. On the ride back, with the cattle recovered and the light going golden in the west, Deaver came up alongside him without being invited and rode there without speaking for a long moment, the two of them moving at the same pace through the dry grass, and Reuben kept his eyes on the middle distance and waited for whatever was coming. "You're working to keep me at the far end of things," Deaver said. Not an accusation, just a statement, delivered with that same calm, unbothered quality that the man brought to everything. Reuben did not look at him. "I put men where the work needs doing." "That's true most of the time." Another pause. The grass moved in the evening wind. "Not every time." "You've got an opinion about how I run this range, Deaver. You're welcome to share it with Braddock." "I'm not complaining about how you run the range." The voice did not change at all, still low, still even, still carrying that quality of a man who has thought carefully about what he is saying before he says it. "I'm telling you I noticed, that's all." Reuben turned his head and looked at him then, finally, because there was no other honest response to what had been said, and dishonesty, even in silence, was not something Reuben Stade made a habit of. Deaver was looking straight ahead, hat brim cutting the low sun, his face carrying that particular stillness that Reuben had spent weeks cataloging without meaning to. And then, as if he felt the attention, he turned and looked back, and for a moment that lasted long enough to be a problem. They held each other's gaze without either of them doing anything to break it. Reuben looked away first. That was also something he marked in the private ledger, the fact of who looked away first and what it meant. "Get the south gate when we come in," he said. "Yes, sir," said Colt Deaver, and he did not say anything else for the rest of the ride. That night there was a card game in the bunkhouse, and Reuben sat in on it because not sitting in on it would have been an absence that required explanation, and Reuben Stade did not explain his movements to anyone. He played two hands badly and one hand well, which was about his average, and he drank a measure of whiskey that he accounted for in the strict internal mathematics he kept on such things, and he was aware the entire time with a precision that was close to physical pain of where Colt Deaver was sitting across the table, and of the fact that twice when he looked up, he found the other man already looking at him, not quickly looking away the way a man does when he is caught looking, but holding it for a half second before his attention returned to his cards, deliberate and unhurried. Reuben did not sleep well that night. He lay in the dark and went through his rules the way another man might say prayers, and he arrived at the same conclusion he always arrived at, and the conclusion provided its usual comfort, which was less than it had been providing a month ago. The thing about Reuben Stade's rules, the thing he had perhaps never fully confronted until now, was that they had never before been tested by anything quite like this. Not by a woman, not by another man, nothing. He had built them in a quieter life, a life where wanting something he could not have had, not been a daily operational challenge. The rules were sound. He still believed they were sound. He simply had not accounted for what it would feel like to enforce them. July burned on. The work was relentless, the way work on a cattle range is always relentless in summer, which was a mercy because relentless work is the best possible mechanism for not thinking about anything other than work. Reuben drove the days hard and came to the end of them tired enough that the dangerous hours of quiet before sleep were brief. He was good at this, at using the land and its demands as a kind of discipline, and for a while it worked. It stopped working the night the summer storm came through. It came fast, the way Wyoming storms did. Nothing on the horizon at 7 in the evening, and a wall of green-black cloud rolling in from the northwest by 9. The kind of storm that comes with pressure you feel in your teeth before you see the lightning. The hands moved to secure the livestock and the equipment, and in the scramble of it, in the rain that arrived before they were finished, the group split, the way groups split in working chaos, each man going to the nearest problem. Reuben was closing the last paddock gate when the sky opened up completely, a downpour so heavy that the stable was invisible at 30 feet, and he ran for the nearest cover, which was the tack room at the back of the stable building, a small timber room where the saddles and rope and tools were kept, low-ceilinged and smelling of leather and lanolin and horse. He was 2 seconds inside, breathing hard and shaking water from his hat, when the door opened again and Colt Deaver came in from the rain. They both stopped. The tack room was not large. It was perhaps 12 feet by 10 feet, and it was full of the organized accumulation of working equipment, which left perhaps half of that space as actual standing room, which was to say that 2 men inside it were not far from each other, regardless of any choice either of them made about where to stand. The rain on the roof was enormous, a white noise that made the small space feel sealed, separate from everything outside it. Lightning came through the single high window in periodic white flashes that lit Deaver's face and his soaked shirt, and the way he was looking at Reuben with that attention that Reuben had never been able to categorize as anything other than what it was. "Rest of the men are in the bunkhouse," Deaver said. "That right," Reuben said. His voice came out steady. He was grateful for that. "Storm like this, they'll be there till morning. Most likely." The thunder came then, the deep rolling kind that lasted, and under it Reuben heard his own heartbeat, which was not behaving in a manner consistent with 11 years of personal rules. He was standing with his back to the saddle rack, and Deaver was 6 feet away, still dripping, and the lightning came again, and in it Reuben saw everything he had been filing away for 7 weeks. The angle of jaw and throat, the dark eyes that were watching him without pretense or performance, the particular quality of stillness in a man who is not still because he lacks feeling, but because he has enough command of himself to choose stillness anyway. He recognized it because it was also what he did. He recognized it the way you recognize something that is like yourself. "Deaver," Reuben said, and his voice was a warning. "I know," Deaver said. "You know what I'm about to say?" "Yes, sir." "Then you know I'm going to say it means nothing changes on this range." "I understand that." The voice was the same as always, low and even and not performing anything. "I'm not asking for anything to change." Reuben looked at him for a long time in the intermittent lightning, and what he was looking for was calculation, was manipulation, was the angled approach of someone who wants something and is working the angle of it. He did not find it. What he found instead was a straightforwardness so complete it was almost disarming. A man standing in a tack room in a summer storm and telling the plain truth about exactly what he was and was not asking for. "You're going to make this difficult," Reuben said, and it came out with a flatness that was not anger, but was something close to resignation. "I'm not trying to," Deaver said, and even now, even here, there was that faint quality in the voice that was not quite a smile and was not quite not one. The rain was tremendous on the roof. The lightning came again, in the white silence between flash and thunder. Something shifted in Reuben stayed that he had been holding in place for 7 weeks by the force of 11 years of personal rules, and he felt it shift, felt the precise internal moment where what he had decided and what he was prepared to do came apart from each other at a seam he had believed was solid. He crossed the tack room in 2 steps, and the rules were still there. He could still name every one of them. They had not gone anywhere. They were simply not, in that moment, the most immediate truth. The most immediate truth was that Colt Deaver was right there, and had been right there for 7 weeks, and the space between them had narrowed down to nothing, and Reuben put his hand against the other man's jaw, rough and calloused against rain-wet skin, and Deaver went still in the way of someone who has been waiting for something and has finally learned whether the wait was going to be worth it. What followed was not reckless. Reuben Stade did not do reckless. It was careful and deliberate, and also more honest than anything he had permitted himself in years. The particular honesty of wanting something and not retreating from it, and the rain on the roof of the tack room was so loud that the rest of the world, the range, the rules, the 11 years, all of it had been temporarily reduced to white noise. And what remained was only this small timber room, and the weight of a hand against a jaw, and the low sound of breathing in the dark. After, they stood in the ordinary dark of the tack room, and the rain continued on the roof without abating. And Reuben's hand had fallen from Deaver's face, and they were not touching now. A foot of air between them again. The ordinary distance of 2 men who worked together on the same range. "Nothing changes," Reuben said. His voice was the same as it always was. He was glad of that. "Nothing changes," Deaver agreed. Reuben pulled his hat back on and turned toward the tack room door. "Rain might let up by midnight. Get some sleep when it does." "Yes, sir." He opened the door and went out into the rain, which had eased to a steady pour from the earlier violence, and he walked back toward the bunkhouse in the wet Wyoming dark. And he was very careful not to examine, at least tonight, what nothing changes was going to mean in the full light of morning. Morning came the way it always did on the Braddock Range, the rooster and the pre-dawn gray, and the smell of coffee from the cookhouse, and the accumulated physical demands of 11,000 acres waiting for the men who were responsible for them. Reuben rose at 4, dressed, checked the sky from the bunkhouse porch, and began the day's tally in his head before he had finished his first cup of coffee. He assigned the morning work in the yard with the same flat precision he always used, sending the right men to the right sections, and when he got to Deaver, he looked at him the same way he looked at every other man, and said the same kind of thing he said to every other man. "You'll work the north fence today. Check the posts that went soft and pull the worst of them." And Deaver said, "Yes, sir," and went. The range was the range. The work was the work. The rules were the rules. They were also, Reuben acknowledged quietly in the part of himself where he kept honest things, no longer precisely the same rules they had been the day before. Not because they had been discarded. They hadn't been discarded. But a rule that has been tested is not the same as a rule that has never been tested. And a man who has stood in a tack room in a summer storm and made a choice with his eyes open is not the same man he was before that choice. Even if everything on the surface looks identical, nothing changes. He turned it over through the long morning of fence work and cattle count, and the 100 small decisions that running a range required, and he arrived at an understanding of it that he had not had the night before. It did not mean what he had meant it to mean when he said it, which was a command to return to the architecture of the previous 7 weeks. That architecture was gone. You couldn't unopen a door. What it meant instead, what it could mean if 2 men who were both honest and careful chose to let it mean this, was that the range was still the range. The work was still the work. He was still the foreman, and Deaver was still a hand, and that order of things would not shift in public, in daylight, in the operational life of the Braddock spread. What existed between them in the quiet margins of that life was a different matter, unspoken and ungoverned by the rules that governed everything else, because it had already proven itself capable of existing outside those rules without destroying them. He was not sure yet if that was wisdom or justification. He suspected it might be both. The summer continued. The heat did not break until September. The work drove them all hard, and the range asked what it always asked, which was everything, and the men of the Braddock spread gave it, because that was what you did out here. That was the whole and only bargain you made with this land. Reuben ran the operation with the same precision he always had, and if there was sometimes a quality in his attention, when a certain hand came in from a far section at the end of the day that was not quite the same as his attention to the other men, no one marked it, because no one was watching for it, and because Reuben Stade had 11 years of practice at keeping his interior life where it belonged. One evening in late August, near the end of the long light that the Wyoming summer provides, if nothing else, Reuben was on the porch of the bunkhouse doing the weekly ledger when Deaver came and sat on the step below him, not asking permission and not needing to, and they were quiet together in the cool and evening while the other men were in the cookhouse or playing cards or sleeping. And it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and also in the particular way of things that have weight beneath their ordinary surface, not ordinary at all. "You planning to stay through winter," Reuben said. He said it the way he would have said it to any hand whose plans mattered to the operational continuity of the range, which was also the only way he permitted himself to mean it. Deaver turned his head slightly, and Reuben could see the line of his profile against the evening light, the jaw he had held in his hand in a tack room while rain came down, which was not something he was supposed to be thinking about during ledger work. "If you'll have me," Deaver said. The phrase was exact. It was precise. It carried every possible meaning it could carry, and also only the meanings that could be acknowledged out loud on the porch of a bunkhouse on a cattle range in Wyoming in 1873, which was the narrow passage through which two honest and careful men were finding their way. Reuben looked down at the ledger. "We need men who know the range through the first snow," he said. "You know it well enough." "Yes, sir," said Colt Deaver, and there was that quality in his voice that was not quite a smile, that Reuben had learned to hear the way you learn to hear weather. The last of the light went out of the sky. The stars came out. In the cookhouse, someone was laughing at something. The range stretched out in the dark around them. 11,000 acres of hard, beautiful, demanding land that Reuben Stade had tended for 11 years and would tend for as many more as the work required, holding it in the daily grip of attention and labor and care. He had given it everything, and it had given him back what the land always gives, back to the men who truly work it. Not comfort, not ease, not respite from the relentlessness of things, but purpose and the specific satisfaction of a life directed entirely outward at something real. He had not known until 7 weeks ago, until a sorrel mare came up the south road and a young man with dark eyes dismounted and looked at him without looking away, that the outward direction of his life had left something in the interior of it that had gone unaddressed for a very long time. He was still working out what to do with that knowledge. He suspected he would be working it out for a while. The range offered no shortcuts on any question that mattered, and this question, whatever it was exactly, whatever name it deserved, mattered more than he had permitted himself to admit until now. But the ledger was done, and the night was fine and cool after the long heat of the day, and Colt Deaver was sitting on the step below him with his hat pushed back and his elbows on his knees, looking out at the dark range with an ease that Reuben had come to recognize as genuine, the ease of a man who is where he has decided to be. And that counted for something out here, where everything that stayed because it meant to. The stars moved overhead the way they always did, indifferent to the small dramas of men, but present above them all the same. Reuben set down the ledger and let the evening be what it was. This was not nothing. He had lived in nothing for long enough to know the difference. This, whatever it was, whatever he was going to call it, in the honest part of himself, where he kept the things that were true, was not nothing. And the Braddock Range waited in the dark, patient as it always was, holding its 11,000 acres of sky and grass and red earth steady under the turning stars, asking only what it always asked, asking only everything, which was the only answer Reuben Stade had ever known how to give. The foreman's law was the only law, until the new hand made him break every rule he ever lived by. Part 2. September arrived on the Braddock Range with the particular authority that September has in Wyoming, not the gradual cooling of other places, but an overnight shift in the quality of the air, something draining out of it that you did not notice until it was gone, a warmth that had been present so long it had stopped being noticed, and was now, suddenly, irrevocably absent. The mornings had teeth again. The light came in at a lower angle across the dry grass and turned everything gold in a way that was beautiful and also a reminder, the way all beautiful things in this country were reminders that the land was not sentimental and did not care whether you were ready. Reuben Stade was always ready. That was the job. That was the point of everything he had built in 11 years on this range, the systems and the habits and the ordered attention to what the land required before it required it, so that when the season shifted, he was already ahead of it. He began the fall preparations the first week of September, the same as always, moving through the checklist in his head that he had refined over a decade of these transitions. Cattle needed to be counted and assessed, and the weak ones cut before the cold set in. Feed stores needed to be inventoried against the projected winter population. Fence lines needed to be walked for vulnerabilities that the summer had opened up. Equipment needed to be checked, repaired, put in order. The bunkhouse needed its winter weatherproofing, the gaps in the boards packed and the roof patched where the July storm had lifted 2 sections of shingle. There was always, on a working cattle range, more to do than there were hours to do it in. Reuben had always found this to be a fact without complaint, a truth as simple and structural as the land itself. The work was what the land asked for, and the work was what he gave it. What was different this September, in a way he was still in the process of understanding, was that the work no longer felt like the only thing. It had been the only thing for a long time, for 10 years if he was honest, since the particular loneliness of his particular life had narrowed itself down to the single clean channel of labor and responsibility and the satisfaction of a range well run. He had not noticed the narrowness until something had entered the frame that was wider than the channel. He noticed Colt Deaver in the mornings now in a different way than he had before the tack room. Before, the noticing had been something he was fighting, something he was filing under categories that kept it at a managed distance. Now it was simply there. The way a fact is simply there, when you have stopped arguing with it. He noticed Deaver across the yard in the early gray light, breath visible in the cold air, moving with that unhurried competence toward whatever section of work was his for the day. He noticed the way the other man's shoulders had filled out slightly over the summer of hard physical labor, the way he had absorbed the particular rhythms of this specific range and made them his own, so that he no longer looked like a new hand, but like a man who had been here long enough to belong here. He noticed all of this and did not fight it and did not indulge it past what the daylight hours and the operational reality of the range permitted, which was nothing, or very close to nothing. The briefest of eye contacts across a yard, the particular stillness that would come over both of them sometimes when they found themselves working in close proximity, the awareness of a shared thing that lived in the margins of the ranch's daily life without disturbing the center of it. Nothing changes. He turned it over regularly, the way you turn over a stone to see what is underneath it, and what he kept finding underneath it was something more complex than he had meant when he said it. The range had not changed. The work had not changed. The order of authority between them had not changed and would not change. He was the foreman and Deaver was a hand, and that was not a temporary arrangement pending some renegotiation. That was the actual structure of the thing. What had changed was inside Reuben himself. In the interior life he kept sealed away from the operational world of the Braddock spread. And what had changed there was that it was no longer as sealed as it had been. Something had been opened. Not forced open, not pried apart, but opened the way a window gets opened in the morning when the air outside is worth letting in. He was still not certain what to do with that, but he had stopped pretending the window was closed. The fall work brought a particular pressure that Reuben had always respected for its clarity. There was no ambiguity in it, no room for interior weather to slow the operational requirements. The cattle needed moving to the lower pastures before the first hard frost. The equipment needed to be functioning by the time the ground froze and manual repair became impossible. Every man on the range had a specific contribution to make to the survival of 11,000 acres through a Wyoming winter, and Reuben drove the preparation with the same exacting attention he brought to everything, which meant there was very little time during the days for anything that was not the work. It was in the evenings that the margins existed. After the cookhouse and the lanterns going out in the bunkhouse one by one as the men settled toward sleep, there were sometimes 30 minutes or an hour in which the world contracted to the porch of the bunkhouse and the cooling night and two men who had learned to occupy the same silence without filling it unnecessarily. Deaver was good at silence. This was something Reuben had noted early and had come to value in a way he had not anticipated. He had spent so many years in the company of men who filled silence with noise, with complaint, or with bravado, or with the restless chatter of men who have not yet learned that quiet is not an absence, but a presence, that he had forgotten silence could be inhabited rather than simply endured. Sitting with Deaver in the evenings, he remembered. They talked sometimes. Not about large things, not about what existed between them, or what it was, or what it meant, because that conversation had essentially been had in the tack room in the rain, and both men seemed to understand that having it again in different words would not make it more understood. They talked instead about the work, about what the range would need in the weeks ahead, about the cattle and the fences and the equipment, about the particular problems of winter on high ground, the way ice formed in the water troughs and needed to be broken twice a day, the way the cattle clustered and sometimes smothered each other in the worst cold, the way the wind came down off the ridgeline in January with a velocity that could kill a man who was not paying attention. They talked about the things that mattered on this range, which was most of what they talked about, and in the spaces between the things that mattered, sometimes other things got said. Small things, observations, the kind of thing you say to a person when you have grown comfortable enough in their presence to let thought become speech without extensive consideration of whether it is worth saying. Reuben was not a man who had said many small things to many people. He discovered, in those September evenings, that he had a capacity for it that he had not known was there. October came, and the range hardened under the first cold. The cattle were in the lower pastures, and the equipment was ordered, and the bunkhouse was tight against the weather and everything that could be done before the winter had been done. Reuben went through his fall checklist in his head for the final time and found it complete. A satisfaction that was clean and total. The satisfaction of a man who has done what the land required of him and done it right. The hands were settling into the winter rhythm. Fewer hours in the field and more hours in the maintenance work that held a ranch together through the cold months, the repairs and the mending, and the daily care of animals that could not be suspended regardless of weather. It was in this rhythm, in the first week of October, that old Braddock came down from the ranch house with his pipe and his flat-brimmed hat and the deliberate walk of a man in his 70s who has learned that hurrying only uses up what little time you have left, and found Reuben at the stable, going through the harness inventory. Braddock was not a man who announced things. He came alongside Reuben and looked at the harness for a while without speaking. And Reuben went on with the inventory and waited, because in 11 years he had learned that Braddock said what he had come to say in his own time, and before that time it was better to let the silence be. "Deaver," Braddock said finally. "What about him?" Reuben said. "Good hand." "Yes." Braddock turned a piece of old harness in his weathered hands, examining the stitching. "You planning to keep him on come spring?" "That depends on whether the work justifies the payroll." "I'm asking what you think." Reuben set down the piece of harness he was holding and looked at the old man. Braddock was watching him with the eyes of someone who has been observing human beings for 7 decades and has gotten reasonably good at it. He did not look like he was asking about payroll. "He knows this range," Reuben said. "He's solid in the field and he makes good decisions under pressure. I'd keep him." Braddock nodded slowly, still examining the harness. "Man like that's hard to find," he said. "Man who fits a place." "Yes, sir. Some men fit and some men are just passing through." He set the harness down. "Takes a while sometimes to tell the difference." "It does." Braddock looked at him once, direct and brief, in the way of a man who has said what he intended to say, underneath what he appeared to be saying. And then he turned and walked back toward the ranch house, with his deliberate old man's walk. Reuben watched him go and then returned to the harness inventory, and he did not examine too closely what the old man might or might not have perceived in 11 years of watching his foreman run a range. Braddock was 71 and had built this ranch from grass and dirt, and had spent his whole life reading what this land and the people on it were telling him. It would not be surprising if he read clearly. What mattered was what he did with what he read, and what he had apparently done was mention that Deaver was a good hand and should be kept on, which was a conclusion Reuben had already reached, and which was the only conclusion that the operational reality of the Braddock spread required anyone to reach. He finished the harness inventory and moved on to the next item on the list. November arrived, and the first real snow came with it. Not the dusting that October sometimes offered as a preview, but a genuine Wyoming snowfall, 18 inches overnight with drifts against the north fence that buried the lower wire completely. The hands woke to a white world and went out into it without complaint, because complaint was not a luxury the range permitted. And Reuben stood in the yard in the early dark, watching the horses breathe steam, and felt the particular clean alertness that winter work on this range always brought him, the way cold stripped everything down to its essentials, and the essentials were always clarifying. The days shortened. The work contracted toward the core necessities. The evenings lengthened, and the bunkhouse was warmer than the porch. So the evenings moved inside, the card games and the conversation, and the lamplight on 11 faces that had been through a summer and a fall together, and had arrived at the specific familiarity that men develop when they share hard work and close quarters long enough. There was a quality to these winter evenings that Reuben had always appreciated, a settling, the way a fire burns down to coals, that put out a steadier and more useful heat than the original flame. In this settling, in this contracted winter world, what existed between Reuben's Stade and Colt Deaver was simply part of the interior of the bunkhouse life, unremarkable to anyone who was not looking for it, and perhaps not entirely invisible to the 2 or 3 men who were perceptive enough to notice things. Reuben was not certain and did not investigate. What he was certain of was that it did not disturb the running of the range or the relations between the men, and those were the only certainties that the foreman of the Braddock spread was strictly required to maintain. Everything else was his own business. It was on a night in the deep of December, the cold outside absolute and the bunkhouse warm from the iron stove in the corner, that Reuben was the last one awake, which was not unusual, going through the week's ledger by lamplight at the small table near the door when Deaver came and sat across from him, in the way he sometimes did when the others had gone to sleep and the night was long. He did not bring anything with him. No cards, no mending work, just himself, and he sat with his elbows on the table and his chin in one hand, and watched Reuben work the numbers in the lamplight without speaking. After a while, Reuben said, without looking up from the ledger, "Something on your mind?" "Not exactly," Deaver said. Reuben made a notation. "What does not exactly mean?" "Means I was thinking something, but it's not a problem. It's just a thought." Reuben looked up then, because 11 years of running men had taught him that thoughts that men describe as not problems sometimes were, and also because he had developed over the past several months a particular interest in what was happening in Colt Deaver's head, which was a new and somewhat surprising condition for a man who had lived as internally as Reuben had for most of his adult life. "Say it then." Deaver looked at him across the lamp, the light between them warm and steady in the cold room. "I was thinking that when I rode up the South Road in June, I had maybe 6 months of work in mind. Maybe less. I wasn't planning on staying." Reuben waited. "And I was thinking that a lot has changed since then," Deaver said, "in terms of what I'm planning." The lamp put light on the planes of his face, familiar by now in a way that Reuben had stopped noting with any particular alarm. Familiar the way the range itself was familiar, known without needing to be examined. He held Deaver's gaze across the table, and the quiet of the winter bunkhouse was around them. The breathing of sleeping men, the small sounds of the stove. "How long are you planning now?" Reuben said. "As long as you'll have me," Deaver said. The same phrase as August, the same precise weight in it, carrying every meaning available within the narrow channel of what could be said aloud. Reuben looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind was at the boards, the Wyoming December pressing in against the warmth they had made inside, the old argument between cold and shelter that this building had been having with that wind since Braddock built it 20 years ago. He thought about the South Road in June and the sorrel mare and a man who looked at him without looking away. And he thought about 7 weeks of trying to maintain a distance that the range was not large enough to provide, and the tack room and the rain, and the September evenings and the morning light in October, and the winter settling around them like a completed thing. He thought about 11 years of rules that he still believed in, and that had been tested now in a way they had never been tested and had held, had not been discarded, but had been understood more completely, the way a tool is understood more completely after you have used it in conditions more demanding than you originally anticipated. He thought about what the old man had said about men who fit a place, and men who were just passing through, and how you could tell the difference. "Range'll need a senior hand come spring," Reuben said. "Perch is talking about heading south. Man knows this land well enough by now. There's a case to be made." Deaver was quiet for a moment. "A case you'd make?" "A case I'd make to Braddock." He looked down at the ledger and made another notation. "Depending on whether the man in question was staying." "He's staying," Deaver said. There was nothing in his voice except the plain truth of it, which was the only way this man ever delivered anything. Reuben finished the line in the ledger and set down the pen. He looked across the lamp at Colt Deaver, 23 or 24 years old, a sorrel mare and a thrown shoe and a season of hard work and the specific quality of a man who was where he had decided to be, and he felt the thing in his chest that he had spent most of the summer trying to categorize and had finally simply let exist without a category, because some things were large enough that putting them in a box only meant you had a box that was too small. "Good," Reuben said. He pulled the lamp closer and went back to the ledger, and Deaver stayed at the table, his chin in his hand, watching the numbers take shape in the lamplight, and outside the Wyoming winter pressed its cold case against the walls and the building held against it the way it always had, the way everything that was built right and built to last held against what the land sent at it, patient and solid in the dark. They sat like that for a long time, the lamplight between them, the cold outside, the ledger filling with the numbers that kept an 11,000-acre ranch alive through another winter. Neither of them said anything else that needed to be said, because what needed to be said had been said, in the economy of words that both men preferred, the economy that this land imposed on the people who were serious about living in it. The lamp burned low. Reuben closed the ledger and set it aside. He stood, and Deaver stood, and they went to their respective bunks in the dark without ceremony, the way two men do who have the same early morning ahead of them and know that sleep is not optional when the work starts at 4:30, regardless of what the night before contained. Reuben lay in the dark and listened to the wind and the breathing of sleeping men and felt the specific quality of the night around him, which was not the same quality it had contained for the 10 winters before this one. He could not have said precisely what was different, not in language that would have satisfied a man looking for a clean explanation. The range was the same. The cold was the same. The work that waited in the morning was the same. He was the same man he had always been. The same rules, the same precision, the same outward-facing attention that had kept 11,000 acres functioning through every season this land could produce. And also, something had shifted, something in the interior, in the part of the life he kept sealed away from the operational world. The sealed part was less sealed than it had been in June. Something had been let in that he had not expected and had not sought and had not known he was missing, until its absence was no longer the condition of his days. He thought about Colt Deaver saying he was staying as long as Reuben would have him, with that plainness that was the other man's essential nature. No angle in it, no performance, just the direct offering of a truth. And he thought that a man who offers truth directly, without negotiation, without strategy, is a rare thing in a world that is largely made of the opposite, and that rarity was not nothing, was in fact something he had stopped being capable of dismissing as nothing several months ago. He had 11 years of rules. He intended to keep them. They were good rules, built for good reasons, and the range and the men on it and the operational integrity of everything Braddock had built here depended on them being kept. He had not abandoned them and would not abandon them. He had also, in the honest part of himself, stopped pretending that the rules were the whole of the story. The whole of the story included a Thursday in late June and a sorrel mare and a man who looked at him without looking away. It included 12 days of noticing and a pump behind the stable in the evening light and 7 weeks of a managed distance that the range finally rendered impossible. It included a tack room and a summer storm and the slow October evenings and the December lamplight. And it included the particular way a life that has been pointed entirely outward for a very long time feels when something turns it, even slightly, back toward itself. It included Colt Deaver saying he was staying with the quiet finality of a man who has made up his mind and does not revisit decisions once made, which was a quality Reuben recognized as kin to his own and found, if he was honest, more reassuring than he would have predicted. The wind shifted outside, and the building settled with a low creak into the cold, and Reuben closed his eyes. Spring would come when it came. The work would be there. The range would be there. He would be there. And Colt Deaver would be there beside him, in the way he had been there through the fall, and would be there through the winter, in the margins of the operational life, in the evening quiet and the lamplight and the morning yards, as unremarkable and as present as the land itself, which asked only what it always asked and received only what was genuinely given and kept what was real. In the spring, Perch did ride south, as he had been saying he would, and there was a conversation between Reuben Stade and old Braddock in the ranch house office that was brief and practical, as all their conversations were. And at the end of it, Colt Deaver was the Braddock Range's new senior hand, a fact announced to the men in the yard on a Monday morning in March, with the same flat delivery Reuben used for all operational announcements, and received by the hands with the various degrees of surprise and lack of surprise that you might expect from a group of men who had spent a winter in close quarters and had varying levels of perception about the things happening around them. What none of them could have known and none of them saw was the moment before the yard, in the narrow space between the stable wall and the feed store, where two men had a few seconds of privacy before the morning's work began, in which Reuben Stade looked at Colt Deaver in the early March light, the last of the snow still on the ground and the air carrying for the first time the faint green promise of what was coming, and said nothing at all, and did not need to. Deaver looked back at him with those dark eyes that Reuben had been cataloging since June, and had stopped trying to manage months ago, and a corner of his mouth moved in that thing that was not quite a smile, and had never been quite a smile, but was in fact better than a smile, more specific, more his, and he said, "You ready for spring?" "I'm always ready for spring," Reuben said. "I know you are," Deaver said, and there was something in it, in the plain way he said it, that was not about spring at all, and also entirely about spring, about what the season meant, and what the range meant, and what being the kind of man who was always ready meant when you were that man, and another man had come to know you well enough to say so without flattery or embellishment, just as a fact, just as a thing that was true and observed and offered back to you without agenda. Reuben looked at him for one more second in the thin March light. This man who had ridden up the South Road in June on a sorrel mare with a thrown shoe and dark eyes that did not look away. This man who had stayed through summer and fall and winter and was going to stay through spring, and however many seasons came after that. This man who was not anything Reuben had planned for or sought or built a rule to account for, who had simply arrived and been exactly what he was, without apology and without strategy, and turned out to fit this place the way a true thing fits, without force and without adjustment, just by virtue of being real. "Get the men moving," Reuben said. "We've got fence to check before noon." "Yes, sir," said Colt Deaver, and he went. Reuben stood for a moment in the narrow space between the stable and the feed store, alone, looking at the last of the snow on the ground and the first suggestion of mud beneath it, the seasonal turn that meant the work was about to change its character again, the eternal reliable revolution of this land through its demands. 11 years he had stood on this range and felt that turn. It had always meant the same thing: more work, different work, the specific satisfactions and difficulties of a new season on hard ground. This year it meant that, and something else. Something he did not put words to, because words were not the currency he dealt in for the things that mattered most. It meant that the winter had held. That what had come through the cold months with him had not been diminished by proximity or familiarity or the grinding daily reality of a working cattle ranch, but had instead done what real things do, grown more solid, more present, more undeniable. It meant that he was not the same man he had been in June, not in the interior, not in the sealed part, which was no longer sealed in the way it had been. He was still the foreman. He was still Reuben Stade, 40 years old, 11 years on this range, the man who ran the Braddock spread with a precision that nothing on this land had yet managed to break. The rules were still the rules. The work was still the work. And the range stretched out around him in the March morning, 11,000 acres of dry grass and red earth beginning its slow turn toward green, patient and enormous under the wide Wyoming sky, holding everything it had always held, and one thing more, the fact of two men who had found in the margins of this hard life something that the land itself had not provided and could not provide, that only people could provide for each other, the specific acknowledgement of being seen, not managed, not assigned a place in a ledger, not categorized and filed, but seen, fully, plainly, without armor or performance, in the honest part of the self, where the real life lives. Reuben Stade put his hat on and walked out into the March morning and went to work. The fence needed checking before noon, and the cattle needed to be counted, and the season needed beginning. And he was the foreman of the Braddock Range, and these things were his to do, and he did 'em. And somewhere on the far side of the yard, Colt Deaver was already moving, doing the same. That was the shape of it. That was the whole of it. And it was enough. And it was real, and it was his, and in a life built almost entirely of what the land required. That was no small thing. That was, in fact, everything.